I first began thinking of the priesthood when I was 7 years old, but as I entered high school, the plan that I had in the back of my mind for so many years started to become less clear. I began to realize what it would mean to become a priest, that I wouldn't be able to be married, that I wouldn't have a family, and that I wouldn't be able to choose my own career path. This realization was important for me, and there was a lot of truth in it, but it led me to stop listening to what God was saying to me. I knew that I wanted to be married and to have a family with a lot of kids, and to do that, I would need a lot of money. So I made the plan to become a doctor. That was my plan all through the last 2 years of high school. But as I began to enter college, I realized that this wasn't my passion. And so instead of asking God what His will was for my life, I picked a major based on what I was interested in, rather than looking at what career options it offered. So I picked English and theology, those two great moneymakers. And it was fine for a while, but when I had to look for jobs, I bounced from interview to interview. But my heart wasn't in it. And as job after job fell through, I came to a point where I had to reevaluate my plan. This journey is reminiscent of the point of view of our first reading from Ecclesiastes. The main speaker in this reading is Qoheleth, which in Hebrew means the one who calls an assembly. It's most likely meant to refer to King Solomon, who at least on one occasion called together the whole assembly of Israel. He is also known for his earthly success, his great wealth, honor, pleasure, and power, as well as his great wisdom. This Sunday is the only time that the book of Ecclesiastes appears in our Sunday readings. And as you might have guessed from just this little excerpt we heard, it's a very unusual book. King Solomon spends 12 chapters examining life from a purely earthly perspective. And yet, as he examines life from this earthly level, he never denies the existence of God, because we can know that God exists through our human reason. So the book begins with what we hear in the first reading. Vanity of vanities, says Qoheleth. Vanity of vanities. All things are vanity. Vanity simply means emptiness, and vanity of vanities means the most empty thing there is. King Solomon, who had all the best in life, wealth, honor, pleasure, and power, is saying that all these things are empty. Take a moment to think about that. This is truly shocking because it goes against all that our culture tells us to value. We are told that if we only get the right job, make the right amount of money, marry the right person, know the right people, we will be happy. But here in this first reading, we have someone who has done all of those things and is still saying that life is empty. So why is this included in today's Mass readings, let alone the Bible? As many people have said, Ecclesiastes tells us the bad news so that we can be ready to receive the good news. If we don't remember the state that we are in without God, we will never understand our need for God. And that's why this book of Ecclesiastes is so often so unremittingly gloomy. It examines the depths of our misery when we are left to our own devices. And as I tried to follow my own path, I made compromises with God. I was still kind of discerning priesthood. Sometimes I would be more open to the idea of priesthood, but any time I was faced with a sacrifice, I would return back to my own plan. As I tried to follow my own path of compromise as far as it would go, I came to a crossroads. Was I willing to sacrifice for the very path I had been taking to avoid sacrifice? Or was I finally willing to make the sacrifice I have been trying so hard to avoid? In the gospel today, we have a parable of someone who is living a life that's purely focused on that earthly level, like Ecclesiastes. When this man becomes successful, he says, I shall tear down my barns and build larger ones, and I shall say to myself, now, as for you, you have so many good things stored up for many years. Rest, eat, drink, be merry. When this man was blessed with abundance, his first instinct was to find a way to hoard that abundance for himself. The biblical scholar John Bergsma says that the man in this parable is condemned, not because he's rich, but because he refused to share his riches with others. I can at least speak for myself, and I know that I sometimes fall into this same trap. This week during Totus Tuus, parents volunteered to bring lunches for the volunteers. And one day we were lucky enough to have an extra burrito from Chipotle. And my first thought was, I'll take it, rather than sharing it with someone else. And it was a really good burrito, by the way. But here in this country, many of us have been blessed with material wealth, and we've also been blessed with spiritual wealth, our gifts and our talents, and every moment of our lives. The question is, what do we do with these riches? If we keep to the purely earthly perspective of Ecclesiastes, we might be tempted to hoard all these riches to ourselves, and ultimately to despair because it all just seems so useless, so futile. But in the gospel, Jesus reveals that this uselessness, this futility, comes from living our lives only for ourselves. The reason we find meaning through sharing the riches we have been given with others. And we are called to share with others because all that we have been given as a gift from God. In following King Solomon's perspective in Ecclesiastes, we've been looking down, keeping an earthbound perspective. But in the second reading, St. Paul tells us, seek what is above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Think of what is above, not of what is on earth. This is a perspective we have to carry with us throughout our daily lives. The gifts we have received are good because they have come from God, but we need to discern how to use those gifts rightly. When I reached the realization in my vocational discernment that I was living a double life, I realized that I couldn't be happy if I continued down the path I've been trying to create for myself. And if I was honest with myself, I was rarely happy when I was following that path in the first place. I have been given gifts. I have been given a vocation. I've been given my very life, not for myself, but to share with others. I realized that I would only be truly happy if I finally gave up my own path, my own will for my life, and began following the path that God had been gradually revealing to me. So I finally met with Father Burke, the vocation director at the time, and applied for seminary. The heavenly perspective that St. Paul offers us helps us to understand the gospel a little bit more clearly. In Jesus' parable, God says to the greedy man, "You fool, this night your life will be demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, to whom will they belong?" This might seem pretty harsh at first, and we might at least have the comfort that we're at least better off than the man in the parable. But this rebuke from God is a call addressed to each and every one of us. At some point, we will die, and our lives will be demanded of us, and the things that we have acquired will no longer belong to us. But it is here and now that we are confronted with a choice. Do we let our lives be taken from us, or do we offer them up freely? Out of all the riches and the gifts we have been given from God, the greatest thing we have to offer is our life. And the more that we try to follow God's plan for our life, the more we die to ourselves, the more we give away what we have been given, the less frightening this parable becomes. If we give of ourselves freely, when our life is demanded of us, we can say, "I've already given it to you." If we share our material and spiritual goods with others, the fact that all these things will be given to others when we die is of no consequence because we've already begun the process of sharing with others. What once seemed futile in the light of Ecclesiastes has now become fruitful in the light of the gospel. And God does not ask us to do what he himself hasn't done himself. St. Paul writes, "Though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich." God loves us so much that he became one of us, that he died for us, so that we can have eternal life with him. And if that weren't enough, he continues to give of himself to us every Sunday here in the Eucharist. This sacrifice, this giving of his life, continues to bear fruit for the salvation of the world. One thing I don't like about vocation stories is that they tend to end with the moment we enter seminary. It almost seems as if everyone's problems are solved by entering seminary. Let me tell you that this is not the case. I still had a lot of learning and growing to do, even after I made the decision to enter seminary. And when I finally made that decision, even after the emotion of happiness began to fade, I was still left with a sense of peace in my decision. And even now, as I prepare to enter my 6th and final year of seminary, God continues to help me to find new places that I need to give over to Him, where I need to continue to grow. But the closer I come to priesthood, the more fulfillment I find in this vocation. When we die, our lives will be demanded of us. We have the choice to seek what is above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God, or to remain in the earthbound view of Ecclesiastes. All of us need to ask God what His will is for our life, what we are called to give. Maybe for some of us, it does involve following a radical new path, maybe discerning a call to priesthood or religious life. But probably for most of us, it involves finding areas of our lives that we have not yet given over to God. It could involve sharing our material gifts by making a donation to the Our Lady of the Angels mission and the sisters who came to visit last weekend. Or it could mean sharing our spiritual gifts by discerning a way that we can use our talents at the service of God and His church. But ultimately, when we seek what is above and place our lives at the service of God and others, our lives are no longer demanded of us, but rather become a gift that we freely give.